Fake news and disinformation dominate the headlines, fill our social media feeds, and infect our politics. And there's no better example of this than the story of Seth Rich. I'm Michael Isikoff, Chief Investigative Correspondent for Yahoo News. In this 6-episode podcast, we're exploring the story of how one man's senseless murder on the streets of Washington spawned bizarre and outlandish conspiracy theories.
You know, our sources face serious risks.
Explosive developments in the mysterious murder of former DNC staffer
Seth Rich was assassinated for political reasons.
We'll hear from those who are spinning the thread.
You'll think I'm nuts. I'm a believer in the deep state.
If Seth Rich was the leaker, of course that would discredit the Russian narrative.
And those who have been caught up in the web.
This is outrageous. You're a pawn in your own son's death.
And we'll reveal how the Russians use social media to pull the strings.
They can stoke it, use it, and weaponize it.
These conspiracy theories have kind of gone into overdrive.
The elements of political suspicion and the genuine unsolved crime drew so many people in.
Welcome to Yahoo News' Conspiracyland.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Dan Klaidman. I'm the editor-in-chief of Yahoo News, and I am thrilled to be here with my colleague of going on 25 years, believe it or not, Mike Isikoff. He is the chief investigative correspondent for Yahoo News and my co-host on our podcast, Skullduggery. And that obviously was a trailer for Mike's new podcast, Conspiracyland, produced by Yahoo News and brought to you by Skullduggery. It is a deep dive into the unsolved murder of Seth Rich and an extraordinary story about conspiracy theories today, how they've infected our politics, the human toll that these conspiracy theories have on the people who get caught up in the web. Mike, I just want to go straight to the story. First of all, just to say that this is a towering home run. It's an amazing piece of reporting and storytelling. What drew you to the Seth Rich story?
You know, as you know, I did a lot of reporting for Yahoo on the Russian interference in the election in 2016 and what they were up to, and the investigations that flowed from that. But I would keep hearing in the background, mostly from Trump allies, that the Russia story was not the real story of what happened. It was what happened to Seth Rich. The claim was that Seth Rich was murdered by the Clintons because of information that he had and actions that he had taken to provide the Democratic National Committee emails to WikiLeaks. This was something that was fueled by Julian Assange himself when he gives an interview in August of 2016 that strongly hinted that Seth Rich was his source. He didn't quite allege it. And then it was a claim that was continually picked up and amplified by alt-right websites and allies of the president, such as Roger Stone. And of course, it ultimately reaches its apex when Fox News reports that Seth Rich was the source for WikiLeaks. Interestingly, they did so the very week that the Russia story is blowing up. Comey is being fired. Mueller is being appointed. So it was very clearly a way to distract from the Russia investigation.
And when you went into this, because we've worked together for a long time. One of the things that I've always been struck by your reporting is you don't immediately assume that a story is a conspiracy theory. You actually check it out.
Right.
So you didn't go into this. I'm sure you were skeptical, but you actually checked it out, right?
Yeah, and we really dug deep into what happened to Seth Rich, who he was, what happened the night or early morning hours that he died. And it was very clear that this was the result of a botched robbery. There had been 7 robberies in the neighborhood where Seth Rich was killed in the 6 weeks prior to his death. They were armed robberies. They very much fit the pattern of what happened to him. But we do know that Seth Rich resisted. He got into a fight with his assailants. The police theory was the assailants panicked and shot him and then fled. The conspiracy theories were given some plausibility because nothing was taken from him at the time.
His wallet
and his, his personal effects, his cell phone, they weren't taken. But when you talk to the cops and prosecutors, they were pretty clear. This is a scenario you see quite often when somebody resists and there's panic and people flee. They shoot and then flee. They don't take the time to take the personal effects. But there was nothing. The important thing is there was nothing that connected this to his work for the Democratic National Committee. He was a relatively junior-level staffer. He didn't play a prominent role. He had no access to the emails on the server at the DNC.
And the theory, of course, was that he was at 4 in the morning. By the way, 3 years ago today, correct?
It was 3 years ago today, July 10th, 2016.
That he's at 4 in the morning, he's going home from a bar.
Yeah.
And the theory is that he was headed to the FBI.
Well, that was the initial claim. So what we discovered in the course of this is we talked to the prosecutor who was in charge of the case. Nobody had ever reached her before. She had retired last year. She was living in Florida. And it took some time to get her to talk. But she ultimately did. And she said she was so frustrated at seeing all these wild conspiracy theories circulating out there about her case, the case she was trying to figure out, and that she used her security clearance to ask the U.S. intelligence community to help her figure this puzzle out. And they came back with what was a smoking gun that really blew her away. That on July 13th, just 3 days after Seth Rich's death, the SVR, that's the Russia's version of the CIA's, its foreign intelligence agency, circulates a bulletin claiming that Seth Rich was on his way to talk to the FBI at 4 in the morning on a Sunday when he is gunned down by a squad of assassins hired by Hillary Clinton. And that was the first really known instance of somebody making the conspiracy claim. It pops up on this obscure website the very same day, whatdoesitmean.com, which is a site that really is a vehicle for Russian propaganda. And from there, it migrates into 4chan and Reddit and these alt-right websites. And by August 9th, 3 weeks later, Roger Stone, longtime advisor to Donald Trump, self-proclaimed dirty trickster, picks it up, tweets a picture of Seth Rich, and says, another dead body in the Clintons' wake.
So I want to get to that and how these conspiracy theories migrated. But this was, just to be clear, this appears to have been what we call an active measure that the Russians have been doing all the way back to the
long tradition going back to Cold War days, Soviet Union. Active measures was the term that was used to describe their disinformation operations, operations designed to foment divisions in Russia's adversaries, often by promoting conspiracy theories.
But this one had the added benefit of also deflecting away from the larger Russian conspiracy to influence our election.
It was the Russians that hacked the DNC. It was the Russians that provided the emails to WikiLeaks. By the way, one thing we do note in the podcast is that according to Robert Mueller's report and his indictment, the transfer of those DNC emails to WikiLeaks via an encrypted file took place on July 14th, 2016. That was 4 days after Seth Rich had died. So that when Julian Assange on August 9th, the very same day that Roger Stone is tweeting the picture of Seth Rich, gives this interview to a Dutch TV reporter who we talked to in the podcast, in which he throws out there suggesting that Seth Rich was WikiLeaks' source, says he is announcing a $20,000 reward for information about the murder of Seth Rich. Asked why, he said, well, we have to protect our sources. The TV reporter is saying, the Dutch reporter, like, what are you saying here? That was a robbery. Why are you even bringing up this at all? He says, we have to protect our sources. So when Julian Assange was suggesting that Seth Rich was the source, he knew that it was a totally BS.
Yeah.
That it could not have been Seth Rich, because they got the emails 4 days after he had already died.
Right. So you've mentioned a couple of characters that are part of this elaborate kind of conspiracy theory ecosphere. And I want to talk, because one of the things that the podcast does brilliantly is show how these conspiracy theories migrate, I mean, in this particular case, from a Russian plant,
right,
but into the kind of dark corners of the web with, trolls and kind of these kinds of characters, and then to alt-right sites, to political characters, and ultimately to Fox News. So talk about that, how that happened.
So, you get a lot of characters who glom onto this case for political purposes, for personal purposes. Episode 3, which we'll be releasing next week, is about a guy named Jack Berkman, who's a D.C. lobbyist who, latched on to the Seth Rich case, announced that his own $105,000 reward, and conducted his own investigation, and then did a filmed reenactment that was just totally preposterous, but furthered the conspiracy meme. Another guy who we'll talk about in episodes 4 and 5 is Ed Potowski, a Dallas money man who had connections at the Trump White House and Fox News. And so you see how it's sort of moving up the food chain at the White House itself. Steve Bannon, then senior counselor to the president. We have text messages that we'll reveal in episode 4, in which he's texting a CBS 60 Minutes reporter. Huge story. It was a contract kill, obviously, Bannon writes in March of 2017 to 60 Minutes. And
of course, that goes to the cynical political motives that a lot of these people have.
Yeah.
Because it was in Steve Bannon's interest, it was in the White House's interest,
of course,
to deflect from
any
Russian involvement.
Right. And who else wanted to promote it that more than Fox News, the president's, own cable station, state TV, as we sometimes look at it. Butowski, the money man, arranges, helps sort of contrive a story that Fox News puts on its website, claiming there was an FBI forensic report showing of Seth Rich's laptop that showed communications between him and WikiLeaks. Totally nonsense, totally non-sourced. Fox News had to retract it 8 days after they published it. But in that in-between time, Sean Hannity is shouting it to the rooftops, hitting it every night, talking about how this, completely demolishes the Russia narrative. Who does he have on that week, by the way? This is interesting. A lawyer confirming everything that Sean Hannity has just said. Jay Sekulow. Jay Sekulow had just been hired by Trump himself to be his lawyer in the Russia investigation. That's not publicly referenced when Sekulow goes on Sean Hannity. But you can see there's a clear interest of everybody involved to use the Seth Rich case to deflect from the Russia investigation. I've said at times this was an instance of collusion of sorts, but collusion not to elect Trump, but to protect him by deflecting from the investigation that was threatening his presidency.
You introduced a term in this podcast that I had not heard before, which is the super spreader.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Right. You'll hear about that in episode 3, which we're releasing next Tuesday. Peter Singer, who's a fellow at the New America Foundation, has studied conspiracy theories and how they are circulated on the internet, said, people who tweet, who post on Facebook, who use social media, who post YouTubes, it's not all equal. There are people more equal than others, people who have large followings, who are influencers, who can project the spread and amplify a message more than others. And in this case, the super spreaders included a guy named Jack Posobiec, who was very active in a group called Citizens for Trump, a Naval Reserve officer who then became a sort of journalist of sorts, who got a White House pass, had access to the White House every day, and he was a super spreader of these conspiracy theories. Actually, the period that this takes place in the summer and fall of 2016 is the same time another really pernicious conspiracy theory is floating out there, and that's Pizzagate. The claim that at this popular D.C. pizza restaurant, Comet Pizza, right near my house, where I've gone to with my family many times. There was a secret dungeon in which children were being trafficked as sex slaves by the Clintons, and Jack Posobiec does a live stream, Periscope, investigating Pizzagate just a few days after the election, in which he claims to see children being taken into this supposed dungeon at the D.C. Pizza Parlor. People listen to this. His YouTube on that got circulated 600,000 times, viewed 600,000 times on YouTube. And one of the people who heard about this was a guy named Edgar Madison Welsh, living in North Carolina, a unemployed volunteer firefighter. He's so concerned about the welfare of the kids, he takes his AK-47 and drives up to Washington and goes into the D.C. Pizza Parlor and with his AK-47 and tries to shoot his way into the supposed basement, which actually didn't exist. One of the things that Jack Posobiec says in this live stream when he gets kicked out of Comet Pizza while he was trying to do his investigation is, I'm too big, I have too big of a following, they can't Seth Rich me. So already, within just a few months of Seth Rich's death, his name had become shorthand for a political murder.
So that story shows the real-world implication of these conspiracy theories, actually inspires people to that kind of action. Right. I want to talk about the human toll of the Seth Rich conspiracy theory, and in particular, the impact that it had on the Rich family. You were able to get them to talk to you, open up to you at great length. And this is really the emotional core of this podcast. And to listen to Mary Rich is just wrenching. Tell us a little bit about
what they have been through is just horrendous. They've had their, they've lost their son, Joel and Mary Rich. They live in Omaha. Under tragic circumstances. And then to have that death being continually circulating on alt-right websites, on the internet, on social media, and ultimately Fox News was so painful for them because, the predicate is that Seth Rich was a leaker, that he was disloyal to his Democratic National Committee colleagues, nothing about his life. And
that he was taking money from WikiLeaks.
That he was taking money, that he sold the emails to WikiLeaks for profit. to have their son's name and reputation sullied that way and continually thrown out there in this loose way by political actors who all have their own agendas was
who exploited them and manipulated
them. You know, look, they wanted to find the people who murdered their son. So when these various actors like Jack Berkman and Ed Butowski would approach them and say, we want to help you find your son's murderers, they were initially receptive, but then they discovered that these were people who had their own agendas and were using them to promote their own version of events. Mary Rich, she had difficulty talking to us at first. We went out to Omaha. She was supposed to meet with us. Joel, her husband, did, but she just was too emotionally overwhelmed to do it.
What was the gut-wrenching thing that she said?
But she finally, we did talk to her at length over the phone, and she said, "This is like losing my son all over again."
Okay, I've got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I guess the first question is, what have you learned in reporting this story about why these conspiracy theories in this particular time in our history have such a hold on so many people, on the American psyche?
Look, as we point out in the last episode, episode 6, conspiracy theories have been with us since the dawn of the Republic. There were conspiracy theories around the time of the Revolution, the 19th century. The Know-Nothings were a party of conspiracy theories. They were secret papal plots manipulating the American government. In the 20th century, no shortage of them. The Kennedy assassination, of course, the Martin Luther King assassination, the Bobby Kennedy assassination. But there were reasons. The idea of the deep state emerged in many ways out of the hearings of the Church Committee in the 1970s about CIA mind control experiments and FBI counter-intelpro. So there were plenty of reasons for people to be suspicious about the actions of the United States government. But, what's happened in more recent years is that with the rise of social media, it has become much more prevalent in which anybody can throw out these conspiracy theories and, they circulate and they migrate and they get amplified in ways that we had never seen before, and they seep into the public consciousness. I remember in October of 2016 flying out to the second debate between Trump and Hillary Clinton at St. Louis in Washington University. And the cab driver, a woman who took me from the airport, I was talking to her, and we started talking about the election, the upcoming debate, and she goes on, well, there's no way I'm going to vote for Hillary. I mean, after all the people she's killed. And I'm saying, well, what are you referring to exactly? Well, she's murdered all these people. My husband told me about it. And I said, where did he learn it? Well, it's all over the internet. We've read all about it on the internet. So, you see, this doesn't necessarily get mainstream media attention, but with social media, with Facebook, with, all the ways people communicate, these wild conspiracy claims, get circulation like they've never had before. They've gone into overdrive.
Okay, last question from me.
Yes.
Is there any accountability from the people who spread these conspiracy
Very
theories?
good question. The Riches are suing Fox News and this guy, Ed Butowski, who was instrumental in the Fox News story. Aaron Rich, the brother of Seth, who talks in the in our podcast, is suing other players like this guy Matt Couch, and these lawsuits are an effort to have some accountability to ensure that the people that spread these sorts of stories, have to face consequences. But, these are long, difficult issues. There's, Fox News has said, their reporting was protected by the First Amendment. Yeah, they may have gotten it wrong. The story was retracted, but that's the nature of the news business, and news organizations have to be free to pursue stories of that are in the public interest.
Well, I would say that if nothing else, your reporting and exposing some of these charlatans bring some accountability to this to them. So
we can only hope so.
Let's take a couple of questions from the audience.
Hi there. I want to know what made you decide to use a podcast as a medium to tell this story as opposed to a book or a documentary film?
Interesting question. We have this podcast, Danny and I, Skullduggery, which we do every week. It's the podcast seems to be an increasingly popular way in which people consume information. And so, I'm always looking for new ways to use whatever talents I have, in more creative ways, and the podcast seemed like a good opportunity to do so. Obviously, it's accompanied by written stories. We had a big one that we posted yesterday that got a lot of attention. I think, it was probably the people who read the story that got it on, got the publicity it did, but hopefully people will take the time to listen to the podcast and take it in the way we hope they'll take it in, which is as, telling a story, but an important story.
Another question?
Hi there. So I'm someone who enjoys reading conspiracy theories and find them really interesting, but not most of them I kind of just don't believe in. And I was wondering, what do you think drives people to believe in, the outrageous conspiracy theories?
Well, interesting that you should say that, because in the very first episode, when I'm explaining, how I got into this, I say something almost exactly like you just said. I've always been fascinated by conspiracy theories, not because I believe in them, because when almost all the big ones that I've studied fall apart under close scrutiny. But as I say in the piece, it's sort of a window into our political soul. What the idea that your political rivals will go to any lengths to achieve their aims and cover up their crimes. The idea that the mainstream media will withhold information from the American public to protect certain people. All of this are reflected in which conspiracy theories we choose to believe and which get traction. Now, it's not a right-wing or a left-wing thing, because there are plenty of wild conspiracies on the left that are just as outrageous in many ways as those on the right. But they get traction because, for one, there is distrust about American institutions. There's no question about that. Number two, they provide a explanation for people for events that are, that there are often not good explanations for. Seth Rich's murder remains unsolved to this day. We don't know who killed him, and the fact that this, in that sense, remains a open investigation and therefore a mystery, fuels conspiracy theories like this.
Well, thank you, Mike Isikoff. Thank you, Bill. And everyone, subscribe to Conspiracyland at Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to Skullduggery.
Exactly.
All right.
Okay.